The sea was restless in the dark, not loud enough to be violent, not calm enough to be trusted. The landing craft rocked gently as if trying to lull the men inside into a false sense of peace. It did not succeed. Nothing could. Private First Class John R. Keller sat with his knees pressed together, rifle vertical between them, the wooden stock damp against his palms. The smell of fuel and salt water clung to everything. Somewhere behind him, an engine coughed. Somewhere ahead, beyond the black horizon, lay an island so small it barely seemed real on a map, Bitio, Tarawa Atoll. No one spoke now. The jokes had died an hour earlier. The bravest thing in the boat was silence. Keller tried to slow his breathing. In training, they had told him fear was normal, that courage wasn't the absence of it but the ability to move anyway. That sounded reasonable on dry land. At sea, in the dark, with artillery waiting somewhere ahead, it felt like a lie told for comfort. Then the sky flashed. A white-orange bloom lit the horizon, followed by a sound that seemed to tear the air apart. Water exploded upward in columns so tall they momentarily blocked the stars. The boat lurched hard to the side. Someone shouted. Another man crossed himself so quickly his fingers blurred. Keller's stomach tightened. This was it. This was the line between before and after. When the ramp dropped, men poured out into gunfire and water. The ocean turned violent, churning with bodies, equipment, and panic. Keller ran because everyone else ran, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant fear. Bullets snapped past his ears like angry insects. He stumbled, caught himself, and kept moving toward a beach that no longer looked like land but like an open wound. This was how 1943 announced itself to him, not as a year, not as history, but as a moment that demanded everything at once. Thousands of miles away, the year arrived differently. Jeffrader WWII stood in a landscape stripped of color and mercy. Snow covered everything, rubble, bodies, weapons, turning the ruins of Stalingrad into something almost peaceful at a distance. Up close, it was a grave that had not yet finished filling. The cold was no longer shocking. That phase had passed weeks ago. Now it was constant, an uninvited companion that lived in his bones and refused to leave. Weiss pulled his greatcoat tighter, though he knew it was useless. Cloth could not fight this kind of cold. He had stopped feeling hungry in the normal way. Hunger had become dull, heavy, ever-present. Food was no longer something you craved. It was something you remembered. The guns were quiet this morning, and that frightened him more than the shelling ever had. Silence meant waiting. Waiting meant thinking. And thinking in Stalingrad was dangerous. A Soviet loudspeaker crackled in the distance, its voice drifting calmly across the snow. It spoke of surrender, of warm meals, of survival. Weiss did not answer. None of them did. He looked at the men around him, faces hollowed out, eyes sunk deep into skulls that seemed too large now. These were not the soldiers who had marched east with songs and confidence. These were survivors, and even that word felt temporary. He wondered, not for the first time, whether Germany understood what it had asked of them. Whether anyone back home could imagine this cold, this hunger, this slow, methodical erasing of hope. 1943 had arrived for Weiss not with violence, but with certainty. The certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. For Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, the year came wrapped in heat and shadow. The jungle breathed around him, alive with insects and unseen movement. Sweat soaked his uniform within minutes, the fabric clinging to skin already weakened by illness and exhaustion. Malaria had left him thin, his strength unreliable, but there was no allowance for weakness now. There never was. Tanaka moved carefully, placing each foot as if the ground itself might betray him. The jungle punished mistakes. A snapped branch, a careless step, either could mean death. He paused, listening. Somewhere ahead, Americans were close. He could sense them, even when he could not see them. Their presence felt heavy, like pressure in the air. At night, He sometimes smelled tobacco drifting through the trees, proof that the enemy was real, proof that the war was not just orders and maps. He touched the photograph hidden inside his tunic. His mother's face stared back at him from another life, another world. He allowed himself one breath of memory, cool mountain air, the sound of home, then pushed it away. Sentiment had no place here. The Imperial army had taught him this. Endure, obey, do not yield. Capture was dishonor, retreat was failure, survival was secondary to duty. Tanaka tightened his grip on his rifle. 1943 would not test his courage. It would test his endurance. 3 soldiers, separated by oceans and ideologies, each facing a different kind of war. For Keller, the war surged forward, loud and relentless, driven by momentum and steel. For Weiss, the war closed inward, shrinking day by day, a noose tightening in silence. For Tanaka, the war pressed down from all sides, demanding patience, invisibility, and sacrifice. None of them knew they were standing at a turning point. They did not know that historians would later mark this year as the moment the balance shifted, when industry, logistics, and attrition began to outweigh ambition and belief. They only knew what was in front of them. A beach that had to be crossed. A city that could not be held. A jungle that would not let go. And as 1943 stretched on, it would ask each of them the same question, again and again in different forms. How much of yourself are you willing to lose to stay alive? Tarawa did not end when Keller reached the beach. In many ways, that was when it truly began. The sand offered no shelter. Japanese machine gun fire cut across the open ground with mechanical precision, stitching lines of death from one end of the beach to the other. Keller pressed himself flat, grains grinding into his cheek, the taste of salt and cordite filling his mouth. Men shouted for medics. Others did not shout at all. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into something shapeless. Orders arrived broken, carried by runners who sometimes never reached their destination. Keller fired when he saw movement, reloaded when the rifle went empty, crawled when standing meant dying. There was no strategy in his mind now, only survival measured in yards. By midday, the sun burned overhead, turning the battlefield into an oven. Bodies lay where they had fallen, impossible to move, impossible to ignore. The water behind them was red. The Marines kept pushing because stopping meant being pinned forever. What Keller did not know, what none of them knew, was that this was the shape of a new kind of war. Brutal, expensive, but relentless. The United States could afford this kind of loss. It could replace men, ships, ammunition. Tarawa was not just a battle, it was a declaration. America was coming island by island, no matter the cost. That night Keller slept in short, broken moments, rifle across his chest, explosions still echoing in his skull. He dreamed of water he could not cross. In Stalingrad, night brought no rest. Otto Weiss lay curled against a shattered wall, conserving what little warmth his body could still generate. Frost crept across the inside of the building like a living thing. Somewhere nearby, a man coughed deep, wet, final. No one responded. Orders arrived sporadically now, scribbled on scraps of paper or passed by officers who no longer bothered with speeches. The message was always the same: hold. Hold what? Weiss wondered. Rubble, memory, pride. He had stopped counting the days. He counted instead the men who disappeared, sent to retrieve supplies that did not exist, to attack positions that could not be taken. The Red Army artillery resumed at dawn, methodical and precise. Each shell landed with a kind of certainty that felt personal. Weiss fired when ordered, retreated when forced, advanced when commanded. Hunger hollowed him out from the inside, turning his thoughts slow and heavy. He caught himself imagining food in absurd detail: bread crusts, boiled potatoes, sausages from a butcher shop he had visited as a boy. These thoughts frightened him more than the shells. They meant his mind was drifting. Rumors spread like infection. Relief armies, breakout attempts, negotiations, none lasted long. Reality always returned, colder than before. When Weiss looked at his rifle now, he no longer felt pride. He felt weight. The jungle did not change for Tanaka. It only waited. Rain fell without warning, drenching everything, turning the ground slick and treacherous. Then the sun returned, steaming the forest until the air itself seemed to sweat. Tanaka moved when ordered, dug when told, waited for hours at a time without sound. Food was scarce. Rice rations shrank. Hunger gnawed, but discipline remained. The Imperial army had prepared him for deprivation, for obedience beyond reason. What it had not prepared him for was isolation. The Americans did not charge blindly. They advanced carefully, supported by artillery and air power that Tanaka could only endure, not answer. Bombardments tore open the jungle, leaving craters where trees had stood moments earlier. Each explosion reminded him how small he was, how fragile. At night, Tanaka lay awake, listening to the jungle settle. He thought of home less often now, not because he had forgotten, but because remembering hurt too much. Instead, he focused on tasks: clean the rifle, check ammunition, watch the perimeter. Survival became a series of quiet decisions. Fire or wait. Move or stay still. Live another hour or risk everything. By mid-1943, the war's direction had begun to reveal itself, though only faintly, like a shadow forming before the object appears. In the Pacific, American forces pressed forward with growing confidence, their losses heavy but replaceable. New ships arrived. New men followed. The machine behind Keller never slowed. In Europe, the German Sixth Army withered, starved not only of food but of options. Stalingrad was no longer a battle, it was an end. Weiss sensed it even before the surrender came. The certainty settled into him like the cold, undeniable and permanent. In the jungle, Tanaka's world grew smaller. Positions abandoned, units shattered, messages delayed or lost entirely. Yet surrender was never discussed. To yield was to erase oneself. Each soldier felt the pressure differently, but the year pressed on them all the same. 1943 did not roar everywhere. Sometimes it whispered. And whispers, when ignored, can be just as deadly. Keller would soon learn that momentum carries its own price. Weiss would face a decision that could not be undone. Tanaka would be forced to choose between orders and instinct. The war was no longer balanced. It was leaning, slowly, inevitably, in one direction. The surrender came quietly. On February 2, 1943, the guns around Stalingrad fell silent. There were no speeches, no final charges, no last-minute miracles, only exhaustion, only cold, only men who could no longer continue. Otto Weiss stood in the snow with his rifle slung uselessly over his shoulder, watching Soviet soldiers approach. They looked healthier than he felt, heavier in their coats, confident in a way that frightened him. An officer barked orders in Russian. Weiss did not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was over. He felt no shame in that moment, only an immense, hollow relief. The waiting had ended. The hunger might end, or it might not. He had heard rumors of camps, of marches east, of men who never returned, but fear had become secondary. What mattered was that the war, at least for him, had released its grip. As he stepped forward, Weiss realized something with startling clarity. Germany had lost more than an army at Stalingrad. It had lost the illusion of inevitability. Far away, men would continue to fight in its name. But here, in the frozen ruins, the future had cracked. For John R. Keller, there was no moment of release, only movement. Tarawa fell after 76 hours of unbroken violence. When it ended, the island looked less like a battlefield than a demolition site. Concrete bunkers lay split open. Palm trees stood shredded, trunks splintered and burned. The smell lingered: salt, smoke, death. Keller walked through it all in a daze. He could not remember when he had last slept properly. His uniform was stiff with sweat and blood, much of it not his own. The men around him spoke in low voices now, as if the island might hear. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. The Marines had taken Tarawa, but at a cost that stunned even those who expected losses. Newspapers back home would later publish photographs, bodies in the surf, rows of graves. For the first time, the American public would see what this kind of war demanded. Keller did not know that yet. He only knew that something inside him had shifted. The fear that once paralyzed him had hardened into something else. Not courage, endurance. There would be more islands. He understood that now. This was not an exception, it was a pattern. And the pattern was working. In the jungle, the breaking point came without ceremony. Tanaka's unit had been ordered to hold a position that no longer mattered. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Ammunition was counted carefully. Men grew quieter, thinner, more inward. Some spoke to themselves when they thought no one was listening. American artillery softened the ground ahead of each advance, methodical and unstoppable. When the infantry followed, Tanaka fought as he had been trained, precise, controlled, invisible until the moment of contact. But every skirmish left fewer of them standing. One night under cover of rain, Tanaka realized the truth he had been trained not to acknowledge. They were being erased. Not defeated in a single blow, but worn down, ground away by a force that never seemed to tire. The Americans rotated units. They ate regularly. They evacuated wounded. The jungle favored patience, but even patience had limits. Tanaka thought of surrender once, just once. The thought came uninvited, stayed for a breath, then vanished, replaced by something colder. Shame, duty, fear of what capture would mean, not just for him but for his family, his name. He pushed the thought away and checked his rifle. By late 1943, the shape of the war was unmistakable to those inside it. Germany, once advancing on multiple fronts, was now retreating, reacting, bleeding. Stalingrad had become a symbol whispered even by those who dared not say it aloud. Japan, stretched thin across the Pacific, found itself defending too much with too little. The empire that had once struck fast now clung to isolated positions. Hopping endurance could replace momentum. And the United States, still learning, still paying in blood, had discovered its advantage. It could lose battles and keep going. It could absorb mistakes. It could turn time itself into a weapon. Keller felt this without understanding it. Weiss saw it too late. Tanaka sensed it and refused to accept it. 3 soldiers, 3 breaking points. And yet, none of them knew how their stories would end. Weiss would soon begin a march eastward into captivity, unsure if survival was a gift or a sentence. Keller would be sent onward, toward another island, another beach. Tanaka would remain in the jungle, fighting a war that no longer existed in the same way. 1943 had broken the balance. What remained was the reckoning. Winter followed Otto Weiss east. The march began almost immediately after the surrender. Columns of German prisoners moved through the snow under armed guard, their boots worn thin, their bodies already weakened beyond reason. Weiss walked when told, stopped when ordered, learned quickly that falling behind invited consequences no one wanted to see. The road stretched endlessly, a white ribbon cutting through a frozen land that did not care who passed over it. Some men collapsed quietly, sitting down as if to rest, never rising again. Others were helped along for a time, then left when helping became impossible. Weiss learned not to look back. At night, when they were herded into makeshift camps or barns, he lay awake listening to unfamiliar languages, coughing, crying, the low murmur of men clinging to consciousness. Hunger followed them like a shadow, but there was something else now, certainty. The war was no longer something he fought. It was something that had passed over him, leaving him changed, stripped down to survival alone. Germany's promises, its slogans, its confidence, all of it felt distant, almost unreal, like a story he had once believed. Somewhere behind him, the Eastern Front continued to burn. Somewhere far away, decisions were being made that would reshape Europe. Weiss had no part in them anymore. His war had ended in the snow. For John Keller, there was no such ending. After Tarawa came training, replacements, brief moments of rest that never quite felt restful. The faces around him changed, some gone, others new, all carrying the same mixture of anticipation and fear. The war pressed forward island by island, each one named, mapped, and scheduled. Keller noticed how efficient everything became. Lessons learned in blood were turned into doctrine. Equipment improved. Coordination tightened. What had been chaos at Tarawa became procedure elsewhere. This frightened him more than the fighting. It meant the war was learning. On the next landing, Keller moved with a practiced calm that surprised him. He knew where to run, when to drop, how to keep his head low. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled him. Something harder had taken its place. At night, he sometimes replayed Tarawa in his mind. The water, the ramp, the men who never made it ashore. He did not speak their names often. Saying them out loud felt like reopening something that had sealed itself shut. America was winning. He understood that much. But victory, from where he stood, looked like an endless road paved with familiar faces that gradually disappeared. In the jungle, the war shrank. Tanaka's unit was no longer part of a grand strategy. It was a fragment, cut off, surviving on instinct and discipline. Orders arrived infrequently now, carried by runners who sometimes never returned. The Empire spoke more softly here, if it spoke at all. Supplies ran out. Ammunition was hoarded. Hunger became constant, sharp, consuming. Men foraged, risked exposure, argued in whispers. Some fell ill and did not recover. Others simply vanished into the jungle, their fates unknown. Tanaka continued because stopping was unthinkable. At night, he watched the stars through gaps in the canopy and wondered how the war looked from above, if it resembled the maps he had once studied, with arrows and lines and neat symbols. Here, there were no arrows, only days. He began to understand something dangerous. Endurance alone could not change the outcome. It could only delay it. Yet delay was all he had left. By the end of 1943, the world had shifted, even if most people did not yet realize it. Factories in America ran without pause, turning raw material into ships, planes, and ammunition faster than enemies could destroy them. New offensives were planned not in desperation, but with confidence. Germany fought on, but now always reacting, its options narrowing, its losses irreplaceable. Japan still resisted fiercely, but the distances that once protected it had become pathways for invasion. And the three soldiers, unknowingly connected by the year itself, carried the weight of this change in their bodies and minds. Weiss carried it in memory, etched by cold and captivity. Keller carried it forward, one landing at a time. Tanaka carried it in silence, in a jungle that refused to acknowledge defeat. 1943 had not ended the war, but it had decided its direction. What followed would be inevitable. Time moved differently after 1943. For Otto Weiss, it slowed to a crawl. Days blended together in captivity, marked not by dates but by survival, by whether there was soup, by whether the guards were indifferent or cruel, by whether the man beside him woke up. He learned how thin a human life could become before it broke. In quiet moments, Weiss thought about Stalingrad, not the fighting, but the certainty he had felt in its final days. The knowledge that something immense had shifted, that the war he had believed in no longer existed as it once had. Germany would fight on, he knew that, but it would fight without the momentum that had once made victory seem inevitable. He did not feel anger anymore. Anger required energy. What remained was understanding. Stalingrad had not just destroyed an army, it had destroyed the future Germany imagined for itself. Everything after was delay. For John R. Keller, time accelerated. Each new operation came faster than the last. The names of islands blurred together, some taken, some bypassed, all part of a steady push westward. Keller noticed how confidence settled into the men around him, not as arrogance but as expectation. They expected to land. They expected resistance. They expected to move forward. And they usually did. Loss never vanished. Friends still died. Fear still visited him before every landing. But the war no longer felt uncertain. It felt directional, as if an invisible current carried them whether they wanted it or not. Keller sometimes wondered what it looked like on the other side, what the enemy thought as American ships appeared on the horizon again and again. He did not hate them. Hatred took effort. He focused instead on the next order, the next objective, the next moment that demanded his attention. 1943 had taught him something permanent. Survival was not heroic, it was repetitive. For Hiroshi Tanaka, time became a burden. The jungle closed in as Japanese positions collapsed one by one. Radios fell silent. Officers spoke less. Some men began to understand what they were not supposed to admit, that the empire could no longer reach them, could no longer protect or supply them. Tanaka fought when he could, hid when he must, endured because that was all he knew how to do. Hunger reshaped him. Illness returned. His body weakened, but his discipline remained, clinging to structure as the world dissolved around it. He no longer imagined victory. Instead, he imagined dignity, holding on to who he was, even as the war took everything else. To surrender would be to accept that the year had decided his fate without his consent. 1943 had not asked his permission. None of these men would appear in history books. No statues would bear their names. No speeches would quote their words. Yet their lives traced the invisible lines of the war's turning, lines drawn not by ideology alone, but by endurance, production, and time. The American Marine represented a nation learning how to fight a global war, and discovering it could outlast its enemies. The German infantryman embodied the moment belief collapsed under reality. The Japanese soldier carried the weight of resistance beyond reason, long after strategy had failed. They never met. They never spoke. They never knew how closely their fates were intertwined. But in 1943, through their suffering and survival, the course of World War II was set. Everything that followed, the invasions, the bombings, the surrender documents, was shaped by that year. The year the war leaned forward. The year it stopped asking who might win, and began deciding who would endure the longest.